Hello again, gamers. Welcome back to the Board Game Captain. I'm the Board Game Captain, and today I'm going to be reviewing and talking about Bestiary 3 for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. So first thing I want to do is I want to give a big thank you to Paizo, the publisher of all things Pathfinder 2nd Edition, including the Bestiary 3, and I want to thank them for sending me this review copy of the Bestiary 3 to read and check out and use in my games of Pathfinder, which I am currently running a Pathfinder campaign, and also, of course, to review and film some content with. So thank you, Paizo. Before we get too into this, I do want to say I've got a ton of links in the description down below for you to check out at your leisure. There's a link to BoardGameCaptain.com, which is a good hub for all things Board Game Captain. And also, Lynn and I have been starting to post some fairly regular blog posts on there and behind-the-scenes stuff. Also, if you're in a position to and like to help out the channel, there is a link to my Patreon in the description down below. And also, there is a link to my Teespring store on the description down below where you can get some cool gamer gear, some Board Game Captain merchandise. All right, so let's talk about Bestiary 3. So I've also got my Bestiaries, the regular Bestiary and Bestiary 2 here, so I can reference some similarities and differences between the first couple of Bestiaries to Bestiary 3 here. And I've taken a bunch of notes on what I found to be the most interesting things in Bestiary 3. So Bestiary 3 is... it is formatted in the same sort of way as Bestiary and Bestiary 2. You've got the table of contents, you have the introduction, which goes over how to read all of the listings of the different creatures, how to roleplay for monsters, how to do adjusting for weak or elite monsters, all the same sort of stuff you come to expect. Then you have all of the monsters done alphabetically, followed by the appendix. So the format has stayed the same, no big adjustments there. But there are some very interesting new types of older creatures and some brand new categories of creatures, and I want to go over them. I'm gonna highlight them, and while I'm going over them, I'm gonna show some pictures up on the screen of various creatures from the Bestiary 3, especially ones that really are of the categories I'm talking about, but I may show some random other just great artwork, because the artwork on these full-color, large hardcover printings of Pathfinder books is always amazing, so I love to show off some of the artwork. Also, just a general topic that I don't want to, start to become complacent about is how awesome the production is from Paizo on these books. Full hardcover, old-school thread binding. Again, if you take care of these books are going to be with you for decades. Really nice, and I also really like the cover art, which shows off some of the interesting creatures in here. There's some really cool clockwork stuff in here, as well as I'm about to talk about troops. This is a troop of skeletons, and also this interesting new fae, the Tooth Fairies, which are kind of creepy. They're more like horror movie versions of Tooth Fairies than the classic Tooth Fairy concept, which is really pretty neat. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is the troops. So troops are a new thing introduced in Pathfinder Bestiary 3. They were not in Bestiary 1 and 2. And they're an interesting way to deal with your party facing off against a large group of enemies, especially ones that have been trained to fight as a unit or magically formed to fight as a unit. Because instead of having just a bunch of individuals, for instance, if you were doing, say, like the cover here where they have a bunch of skeleton infantry, instead of just having a bunch of skeletons and actually having them all activate individually, they turn into a single creature called, in the case of the skeletons, called a skeleton infantry. They take up a fairly sizable space, and as you do damage to them, they shrink, and they take up a smaller space and a smaller space, and it reduces their stats and the number of actions they get until you completely wipe them out. But then they activate as a single creature. The whole unit activates as a single creature rather than having to activate a ton of different skeletons, which is really useful for you as the game master, not to be bogged down with having to control a dozen different skeletons. These troops are really, really great for that. So now I want to draw attention to some specific troops that are very interesting, that I like a lot. So the first one I want to talk about is the Hell Knight Cavalry Brigade. The Hell Knights, of course, are a specific order of knights that are referenced quite a bit in Pathfinder. And here you have a whole brigade of them acting as a unit, starting out as gargantuan in size but can shrink as you do damage to them, and also having lots of interesting actions they can do to represent basically methods of attacking that they have drilled in, that they are very good at. For instance, like a lance charge, which takes 3 actions. But then the brigade forms up and strides twice with a 10-foot circumstance bonus to its speed. If it moves at least 10 feet, the brigade deals 3d8 plus 13 piercing damage with a difficulty class of 26 basic reflex save to each enemy within 10 feet of the brigade when they charge. So this is a great way for them to charge up and attack like the whole party, and you have to sort of dodge their charge. This is something that is very common amongst the various troops, which is really cool. The next one I want to talk about is the Rancorous Priesthood, which basically represents a bunch of cult leaders, a bunch of cultists who are charging at you. They actually have magical abilities, which makes them one of the most interesting of the troops, because it is a bunch of spellcasters, a bunch of people with basically holy spells granted to them by whichever deity it is that they serve. Now, in the case of the Rancorous Priesthood, they are obviously meant to serve dark deities because they speak Abyssal, and they have, for their spells and their theme and their flavor, they're obviously more evil in their flavoring. They are, in fact, chaotic evil as their alignment, but you could adjust this to make a Rancorous Priesthood that follow any of the deities or any pantheon in particular, which is really cool. And they kind of talk about that, and that's really interesting to me. Next, I want to talk about some undead troops that they have. So there is a Shambler troop, which is meant to be a troop of mass zombies. And then there are some update grades you can give them to make them specific types of zombies. For instance, one of the new creatures for the new undead in this book is the Sulfur Zombie, and there are options for turning the Shambler troop into being having a putrid stench as one of their abilities to be like the Sulfur Zombies. There are also the Skeleton Infantry, to have a whole troop of skeleton infantry, which again is another cool option for a horde of undead for your party to fight. There are also some other interesting, very basic troops like a city guard squadron, which again, very self-explanatory, or also some very interesting troops like the Night Marchers, which are like a horde of ethereal ghosts that are not necessarily evil. They're just spirits, and they're the sort of thing that maybe you need to avoid rather than fight. And also there are the Terracotta Garrison, which is a very cool troop based on the real world terracotta soldiers over in China. And this is also part of another theme I'm going to touch on later in this review, which is a lot of new entries that represent Eastern legends, folklore, and myths, and just an Eastern flavoring to allow you to go adventuring with your party in the more eastern parts of Golarion without just, adventuring around the inner sea region, which is generally Golarion's version of the Mediterranean. There's a lot of stuff that is obviously based on things from China and India and also Japan. So you can do a lot more adventuring with this book further off east. So now I'm going to jump ahead from what I was originally talking about, because that really transitioned well to talking about the Eastern monsters. And there's a lot of them in here, so I want to talk about some of my favorites. So the first one I want to talk about, a very interesting one that I was a big fan of, is and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, but the Beto-Beto-san, which obviously has a very Japanese feeling and flavoring. It is a spirit that follows you on lonely roads. It is not evil. But it's creepy. It's creepy. It follows you along. You're not really sure how to take its bizarre following, its stalking of you down these roads. But you can interact with it, and you can fight it if you want to, but you don't necessarily have to, which makes it a very interesting encounter to have with the party, where it's not necessarily going to be a combat-based encounter. Then also I want to talk about that they have the Imperial Dragons. And the Imperial Dragons are a new type of dragon that are obviously based on Asian dragons from all over Asia, including the fact that the Imperial Dragons have the different number of toes. Now, I often forget which number of toes it is that specifically represent dragons from China versus Korea versus Japan, but I'm sure they're all covered in here because lots of the different kinds of dragons have different numbers of toes, and they're very interesting in the fact that these dragons do often take a active role in human society. In fact, there is a nation state in the east of Galarian that obviously is meant to represent the nation of China in this fantasy fictional world, and they are ruled by a dragon emperor that is an actual dragon, obviously a reference to the dragon emperor of China, the first emperor of China, but in this case it's now actually ruled over by an ancient dragon, which is really interesting, really cool. It could make interesting flavoring for adventuring in that part of the world. Next, I want to talk about a number of things that have a very Japanese flair to them. Specifically, we have the kami. Now, the kami are spirits in Japanese culture, and there are many types of them. You have kodama. I am a big fan of these sort of mythical spirits. Kodama are like tree spirits. You also have the zuishin and the toshigami. My apologies if I mispronounce these, and also the shikigami. These are all types of kami that really are from Japanese folklore and Shintoism, I believe, and they are represented in this book, which is really cool. In addition, we have the Kitsune, the Ninetails, which also appeared as a playable creature in the Pathfinder Ancestry Guide. Now they appear as a just basic creature or NPC that you can use here in the Bestiary 3, which is continuing with a theme that they've done with a lot of the other previous books, where around the same time they will have books come out that both have the creature as a NPC and the ability to play it in a different book. They also have the Kirin, the noble beast, the Kirin from Eastern mythology, which is a very interesting monster, and also the Kappa, which is kind of like a Japanese cryptid of a reptilian creature. In this, they've made it specifically a turtle creature, and they have some really bizarre rules for how they function. But yeah, it's in there. And then in addition, from a lot of Japanese folklore and myths, which have also showed up in Japanese pop culture movies, they have some creatures that are like the stuff of absolute nightmares. Terrifying creatures that have showed up in both Japanese horror stories as well as Japanese horror movies. We have the Joragumo, which is a horrible spider-like creature that disguises itself to be a person, but then can reveal itself and attack you. We also have the, again, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce these, the Kuchisake Ona, which is this horrifying creature that looks like a woman, covers her face, but when she reveals her face, she's slit from ear to ear. And she is very dangerous, and while she may not kill you, she may leave you disfigured. Also, there is another just horrifying sort of undead mythological creature from Japan, the Kuro Bosu, which I'm going to show a picture of on the screen here. Without even telling you too much about it, I'm pretty sure you can get why it's horrifying from the way it looks in the image of it. There's a ton of very interesting, again, Eastern flair monsters in this book. Okay, next I want to talk a little bit about the fact that there's a ton of new Celestials and New Fiends in here. So we've got a whole new type of new Celestials in the Agatheons, which are creatures from Nirvana. They're Celestials. They look like anthropomorphic animals. They have ones that look like dragons, ones that look like foxes. But they are all creatures that hail from the plane of Nirvana. We also have the Asura, a new type of fiends that are supposed to be mistakes. They are the living embodiment of mistakes made by the gods. There's some very creepy and bizarre looking creatures there. There's a bunch of new types of Quaddles, as well as some very interesting new types of demons and devils. And then we have some more whole new categories of fiends and celestials. So we have the divs. The divs are some very interesting and creative fiends that the entire group are corrupted genies, which is very interesting. Genies that have turned into fiends, and they can be very creepy and very interesting. Lots of new types there. Have to go quickly, though, just because of how many different types of creatures there are to talk about. There are also the new Guardian Beasts. Again, a new type of Celestial. This one with an Eastern flair. Again, tons of creatures in here with that Eastern theme. Obviously meant to look like the lion statues that you see in a lot of Eastern architecture. And basically like the Eastern equivalent to gargoyles. But these are very good and positive celestial beings that can come to life, possessed basically by these celestial spirits to protect holy sites and people. There are also new types of Rakshasas and also another new type of fiend, whole new type of fiend known as the Sakhil, which are basically corrupted psychopomps that become creatures of fear and terror. Again, this is another new type of creature that really are the stuff of nightmares. I love the adding in of these creatures that can really help to chain into doing horror-themed Pathfinder games, and there are a ton of new creatures in here that really work towards being able to do horror-themed Pathfinder games, and I really like that. Now, I do think that talking about creatures that can help you do horror-themed Pathfinder games chains into the fact that there are a ton of new mythos monsters in here, stuff based on H.P. Lovecraft's mythos. So now we have rules for the Migo, those creepy fungoid scientists from another planet that drift through space and come to Earth. There's also rules in here specifically for the, how do I pronounce them? The Grioth, which again are like alien creatures that come here. They're first scouts of an invasion fleet, may possibly conquer the world. Also, the Night Gaunts, creatures from the Dreamlands that feed off your emotions. Very creepy stuff. And also the Yithians, or as they were originally called in the Lovecraft mythos, the Great Race of Yith. There are the rules for all of these in here. I think these are a fantastic addition to all of the mythos monsters we already have. I can't wait till they do rules for a Star Spawn of Cthulhu. I really want one. But you know what? Even though I didn't get a Star Spawn of Cthulhu yet, I love the Migo, and I love the Yithians, and I love the addition of them to this book. Next, I want to talk about some new interesting giant animals. So I always love giant animals that are normally small, or giant bugs or giant crustaceans, things like that. I'm a big fan of giant creatures because it's very easy to explain to your party, to your players, what it is they are facing when you say it's a giant spider, it's a giant rat, what it is. Very easy for them to understand. All you need to basically do is tell them how big it is, and they get it. They are not the most interesting monsters, but I am a fan of them. And there's a lot of new giant animals in here, and I love that. So I want to call out some of my favorites. There's a giant opossum. There is a giant porcupine. There's a giant skunk. There are giant seahorses, which can actually be used as mounts by some of the water-breathing sentient races. There is a giant vulture, a giant flying squirrel, a giant pangolin, and my personal favorite of all the giant animals, the giant hermit crab. Really awesome. In addition, just like with the giant animals, I'm also a big fan of bringing back extinct species to use in Pathfinder. I love it when they have dinosaurs or Ice Age species, things like that. And we've got a ton of new ones of these. So they have included rules in this book for Eurypterids, the ancient sea scorpions that predated the dinosaurs. We also have rules for Megatherium. Megatherium, of course, being the largest of the various giant ground sloth species. I love that. Also, trilobites, again, creatures that were kind of crustaceans that dated back to before the dinosaurs, but lived for an unbelievably long amount of time. In addition to just trilobites themselves, there's also trilobite swarms, which is a good call for trilobites because these are fairly small animals, about the size of modern day crabs and lobsters. Then we have, of course, the terror birds, creatures from around the time period when North America and South America in the real world were starting to connect together. You had giant flightless birds with raptor predatory type beaks, similar to those on eagles and hawks, that were able to hunt smaller mammals and reptiles and eat them. The terror birds are really cool. They've gotten a lot of appearances in pop culture and in TV shows and whatnot. And I'm a big fan of terror birds. And then also we have mosasaurs, which were giant predatory, seagoing reptiles that were from the time of the dinosaurs. Mosasaurs are really cool and ferocious and make really cool water animals that your party could go up against if you are playing either aquatic species or if you are going on a seagoing voyage. These are the sort of things that could be sea monsters in the water, and that is really awesome. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is something that I talked a lot about specifically in Bestiary 2, and it was a big part of the reason why I was a huge fan of Bestiary 2, something that I thought was a big bonus of Bestiary 2 over the original Bestiary, whereas the original Bestiary had a lot of basic monsters, giants, dragons, trolls, etc. The Bestiary 2 went into a lot of monsters that were based on folklore and cryptids and pop culture stuff, and there's a bit more of that in Bestiary 3. So I've called out a bunch of my urban legend, cryptid, folktale sort of monsters that are my favorites from the third Bestiary, and here they are. So you've got the Mothman. Now, Mothman is not a specific creature in this. It is more of a race of creatures. There's a bunch of them, but there are rules to run into the Mothman. We also have the Sasquatch, Bigfoot, and that's great. I love that Sasquatch is in here. Again, another welcome addition, and the Globsters. This one's a little weird. It's a bit niche. Globsters in reality are just giant balls of rotting whale blubber that wash up on the beach, but a lot of people thought they were some sort of gelatinous blob-like sea creature, maybe like a giant, something akin to a jellyfish, I guess. They have rules for them, and they are in here. And then next, one that I have a great fondness for, specifically because of the Disney movie Baby, Secret of the Lost Legend from the 80s, which I saw in theaters and was obsessed with. The cryptid Mokele Mbembe, which is a cryptid that people believed was a surviving dinosaur in the Congo of Africa, possibly a sauropod. They have rules for the Mokele Mbembe here. Next, I want to talk about that. Like these cryptids and these urban legend type things, there was a creature that is literally the living embodiment of an urban legend, and that is the Brainchild. Now, the Brainchild I found fascinating because this is a creature you start hearing about in a particular town that you're in. You hear about all these legends, and the legends that you hear about, whatever the legends are that you are convinced of by people, will feed into its powers and abilities. And this is fascinating. I love that they did this. This is literally a living urban legend which draws its power from what people believe about it. And that is really cool. And next we have a folklore creature that has become a pop culture creature because of a bunch of movies made about it. We have the Krampus. Now, interestingly, unlike the Mothman, which they made the Mothman a race, Krampus is actually a specific individual creature, and a really powerful one at that. Krampus is a level 21 creature, and this feeds into something else that there's a lot of in here. There are a lot of creatures that are incredibly powerful that could be things that are like the end goal of an entire campaign for you to defeat or face or appease. There are creatures that are above level 20, and there's a ton of them in this book. There have been some before in previous books, but I think there seems to be an above average number of them in this book. I do want to briefly touch on, as I said before, there's a ton of monsters here from Eastern myth or Eastern flavoring. There's also a few more monsters from the more African kind of flavoring and mythology, which is really cool. There have been a bunch previously in the other books, which together can help you to play a lot in the South in Golarion. Similarly to how all of the new Eastern monsters here now can help you play in the East. A couple I want to draw attention to were the Kishi, which is a kind of weird sort of shapeshifter where it has a hyena head on the back of its head, but on the front it looks like a human, and it tricks you into thinking it's a person, and then only reveals its true form by swinging its head around and attacking you when it's lulled you into a false sense of security. And also the Shabti, which are creatures obviously based on Egyptian mythology, which is really cool. And I like that they have continued to expand on creatures that are obviously based on an African flavoring or African folklore or myths. Now, lastly, I want to talk about just a bunch of really cool stuff that's in here, because this book is just jam-packed with really cool creatures. So another one of the super high-level creatures I want to talk about, similar to Krampus, is the Green Men. Now, the Green Men are not a single individual, but a a number of creatures. Again, this is based on more European folklore and mythology from before most of Europe was converted to Christianity. But the green men were a sort of nature-based deity from that time period, and you still see lots of people put little statues or little reliefs on in their garden to be green men to help superstitiously help the plants grow. And they're a really cool part of folklore and culture. And the green men are level 24 creatures. They're basically demigods, incredibly powerful. Again, another level of these creatures that are incredibly powerful, that are things that you're definitely not going to be able to face or appease as lower level characters. Maybe you'd be able to talk your way out of a situation if you had upset a green man, but you definitely aren't going to beat them in a fight, and at least not as a lower level character. Maybe as close to level 20 characters you might be able to beat one in a fight. As a group, these things are really powerful. Also, I want to talk about a very interesting creature known as the Sword Keeper. The Sword Keeper is a bit of a construct. There are lots of interesting new constructs in here that are based on like clockwork creatures. There's a bunch of interesting clockwork creatures which very much remind me of the Dwemer clockworks from the Elder Scrolls series, and I love those. But also specifically, this Sword Keeper is a really interesting one where it is a construct made to protect a powerful magic sword. So the interesting thing about the Sword Keeper is that after you defeat it, it has a magical weapon encased inside of it that you get as your reward for defeating it. So, while it's in there, it powers, the magical weapon powers some of its own attacks. So you do get kind of like a preview, a sampling of what the magic is that you're fighting to release, hoping to get once you defeat the Sword Keeper. Really cool. In addition, we've got a bunch of Titans in here. Now, the Titans, they include the Hekaton. Let's see if I can pronounce this correctly. The Titans include the Hekaton Quieres, which of course were the hundred-handed, which were from Greek mythology, which were not actual Titans in Greek mythology. They were a sibling race to the Titans, one of the other groups that were given birth to by Uranus and Gaia in the original mythology. In this, all the various Titans, I like that they've included them, but they've kind of changed the mythology a bit. And instead of making them the generation of celestial beings before the gods, they are creatures that were created by the gods. So they have altered them a bit, but there's some very interesting ones, and they are very cool. And I very much like that they included the Hekaton Quieres, because I always thought they were one of the more interesting creatures described in Greek mythology. And they are in here. Again, from the cover, the Tooth Fairies, which are very creepy and really cool. There's some new were creatures, which include werebats and were crocodiles. I'm a big fan of including those in here. There is a fascinating creature that is a Dreamweaver called the Dramophir. They're not necessarily evil, but they're creepy and they're weird, and their motivations are unknown. So you may have to go up against them sometimes, because sometimes they will choose to take their victims away into the dreamlands. And yeah, if that happens to a party member, that could be a whole big subplot, a whole big quest of having to deal with the Dramophir to save one of your party members or to save an important NPC. Also, there's a really cool race of creatures in here that are definitely a callback to some creatures from old school D&D. There are the Gertabullu, which are part scorpion, part humanoid creatures that live in the desert. They are very interesting. They protect these ancient holy sites. They are wary of outsiders, but again, not necessarily evil, and can make some very interesting encounters. Also, they have these house spirits, which very much seem like they are based on some folklore type creatures that can be very interesting. And one last very interesting thing I want to draw attention to is the Scale Scribe, which is a very interesting creature that sometimes befriends magic users and likes to write down magical spells and write them over for the wizard, and can basically write you magical scrolls and write down spells in your spell book for you. Very interesting creature, not really a familiar, but just really fun. There's a lot of really cool stuff in here, and I haven't even been able to talk about tons of interesting things in here, like all the new kinds of hags and all the very interesting aberrations and nature spirits that there are tons of in here. Just absolutely tons of material in the Bestiary 3 and tons of very interesting creatures. So now obviously I do believe that these books are very much formatted in the fact that you should buy them in order. You should get Bestiary, then Bestiary 2, then Bestiary 3, because the first Bestiary has all the basic creatures that you're really going to need, and then as you go along, you get more specialized and interesting creatures, either because they are creatures based on pop culture or folklore or cryptids, or because they're creatures like in here, there's a ton of from other parts of the world, like there's a lot of stuff with those Eastern themes on them. And that is really awesome. But I highly recommend Bestiary 3 to continue your collection after getting the Pathfinder Bestiary and Bestiary 2. Bestiary 3 is fantastic. And I'm going to give Bestiary 3 8 out of 10 stars. This is a really good book with tons of awesome stuff in it. I highly recommend it. I also can't wait for there to be the Bestiary battle cards for the Bestiary 3. I really love collecting all of those. I love having those quickly available, but there is tons of stuff in here. We are talking about a total of, including the appendices, 318 pages of content in Pathfinder Bestiary 3. And my favorite thing in here, of all the stuff I talked about, and I just want to give another big callback to it, is the troops. I love the troops. I think the troops are a great way to make it feel like your player characters are fighting against a huge horde of enemies, but make it very easy and manageable to do so. And I hope they do tons of more troops in the future. I think the troops are great. I really like them as a interesting kind of swarm, because they are similar to swarms, but a swarm of human-sized, medium-sized creatures, because all of these because swarms are generally of smaller creatures, small or smaller, like small and tiny creatures, whereas the troops are usually human-sized creatures. So there you have it. This is really awesome. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns on the Bestiary 3 for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, feel free to put them in the comments down below. And if you'd have enjoyed this review of a role-playing game book, and you'd like to see me do more like it, be sure to give this video a like, share it on all forms of social media, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to the Board Game Captain. That is Captain spelled with a K on YouTube. And until next time, game on.